Right, Cineworld, folks, has pulled all of screenings of The Lady of Heaven. It's a film about the daughter of the Prophet Muhammad after it prompted protests outside some cinemas. The Bolton Council of Mosques called the film blasphemous and said it underpinned with a sectarian ideology for depicting the Prophet Muhammad, which is seen by some as an insult in Islam. In my opinion, it's not good enough to just be insulted and plan to pull something, but there we are. But the film's producer Malik Shilbak said no one should dictate for the British public what they can and cannot watch or discuss. I couldn't agree more. Describing the protesters as fringe groups. Yesterday, an imam who backed calls for the cinemas to block the film has been sacked as a government advisor on anti-Islamophobia. So I'm asking you, should Cineworld have bowed to the protesters' censorship demands? I can think of no one better to join me to discuss this than the chief political writer at Spiked, Brendan O'Neill. Brendan, hello. Thank you very much for joining me. Brendan, you wrote a Spiked Online column about this in this week. Why do you think it's so important? Because I know you've been chronicling really similar things, actually, where you've seen the murder of gay men not being reported because people are too scared to write about the fact that potentially gay men are being targeted by terror, and all of these really important other things where we just can't seem to have debate and speech around this issue, Brendan.
Yeah, I think cinemas caving into a mob of religious fanatics is absolutely obscene, and it really has no place in the 21st century. We should not be dictating to the public what they can watch and what they can listen to and what they can talk about according to the tastes of a bunch of religious fundamentalists. That is the bottom line of freedom of speech. And I think the most shocking thing for me about this entire incident has been the silence of the elites. You know, a few politicians have said things here and there about these Islamist mobs shutting down a film, but most of the political and cultural establishment have been silent. They are moral cowards. They are sacrificing freedom to appease a tiny mob of religious fanatics, and that is completely unacceptable. What we should be saying to these protesters is our freedom matters far more than your feelings, and that is how you have to live in a free society.
Brendan, I'm just going to bring in the former chair of the Conservative Muslim Forum, Mohammed Amin. Have we got Mohammed there? Yeah, brilliant. Mohammed, I wonder, would you actually argue that it's right that some Muslims find this offensive? Do you think actually there is merit to the argument?
Well, first of all, many Muslims do find the film offensive, but we live in a free society and you have the right to create and publish films regardless of whether it upsets some people.
Right, yeah, OK, then that's exactly what Brendan's just been arguing, really, right? No one has a right, ultimately, to not be offended.
I agree.
Yeah. So, Brendan, then, I wonder if there's a sort of a middle ground here, right? Lots of people found Monty Python offensive when it first came out. We've got to shrug our shoulders and stand up for democratic values in a free society.
Absolutely. Everyone has the right to feel offended, but they don't have the right to act on that and to try and crush any cultural product or film or piece of music or piece of literature that made them feel offended. That's the bottom line of living in a free society. And one of the things that horrifies me most about the silence around these Islamist mobs is that there is this implication that is given that they are representative of the Muslim community more broadly, and therefore we can't really criticize them too much. We might offend Muslims, we might make Muslims feel bad. But I don't think these fanatics are representative of the vast majority of Muslims in this country, of our Muslim citizens who want to live in the same way that the rest of us do, which is freely and peacefully and fruitfully. So we have to start making a distinction, I think, between this kind of fanatical noise that is being made over an apparently offensive film and the vast majority of ordinary law-abiding Muslims who don't go along with this. And I think identity politics has this tendency to lump everyone together and to say, well, you belong to this ethnic religious bloc, and therefore you must all have the same feelings. I think that's a species of racism, woke racism, which we need to start challenging.
Mohammed, one of the protesters said that it's not OK to offend 1.8 billion Muslims. But do you think it's accurate to say that this film, the showing of this film, is offensive to all Muslims? Surely that's not the case.
I think the film will be offensive to a very, very high proportion of Muslims. I haven't seen the film. I've seen a trailer of it. But the answer when you're offended by something or you think that you will not approve of something is to not watch it. I didn't read the Satanic Verses by Salman Rushdie. Apparently it was a very long, very sort of boring book anyway. But if I think something is going to be offensive or upsetting, you don't have to actually go and read it or watch it.
Yeah, I mean, Mohammed, do you actually worry that ultimately protests like this cause more long-term damage than good to communities and cohesion?
They cause enormous damage. I'm 71 years old, so I still remember the demonstrations in the late 1980s, about 1989, I think it was, about Satanic Verses and Muslims burning books on the streets of Bradford. And that put Muslims in a terrible light because the last people to burn books were the Nazis. And I've always described the protests against the Satanic Verses as a massive own goal by British Muslims. The right way to deal with something like that upsets you is to explain what's wrong with it, explain why you don't like it, and then to stand to one side. And if somebody wants to read it, wants to watch it, that's their privilege.
Yeah, because actually, Mohammed, I would argue that they've done a fantastic PR job for this film and actually given it publicity like you wouldn't believe. But Brendan, the Cineworld actually said in a statement that they pulled the film to ensure the safety of their staff and their customers. Do you think they were right to do that? Do you think they struck the right balance there?
Absolutely not. I think they should have held firm. I think cultural institutions should always hold firm when there are mobs outside demanding that something be shut down. And that goes for whether it's an Islamist mob, as it is in this case, or a bunch of Christian homophobes, which has happened in the past. You mentioned Life of Brian. There were lots of Christians, blue-rinsed right-wing Christians who protested against that film. It doesn't matter who the collection of people is. What we need to say to all of them is, listen, I'm sorry you're offended, but freedom of speech is more important than your feelings. And I agree with Mohammed that the response to things we find offensive is to switch the channel, turn away, don't read the book, don't see the film. There are lots of things I find offensive and I try to ignore them or I try to engage with them constructively. But I think we do have to ask ourselves why these kinds of gangs of radical Muslims, which is what we are seeing, why they feel at liberty to act on their offense. And I think they are influenced in a large part by cancel culture, by woke culture, which now is mingling with a kind of archaic view of blasphemy to create these kind of very intolerant movements against freedom of speech. So we're witnessing a very unholy marriage between 21st century cancel culture and very ancient forms of punishing blasphemy, which has given rise to these protests. And we need the political establishment to say, no, you don't do this in 21st century Britain.
Well, indeed, because I tell you what, I don't think a modern-day Mary Whitehouse, Brendan, would get much truck by arguing that, Christian values were being basically run roughshod over because of modern-day debauchery and all the rest of it. We would rightly just laugh at that, right, and say, well, to hell with you. But there we are.